Thank you very much, Stephen, for those very generous remarks. Mr. Doug Ferguson, Australia's distinguished Foreign Minister Julie Bishop, Senator Penny Wong, Chris Bowen, the Shadow Treasurer, and very particularly our three honorees tonight, Richard Woolcott, Hugh Morgan and Warwick Smith. Can I join everybody else in congratulating the Asia Society on 20 years of building the links between Australia and the Asian region, as well as building links on a bilateral basis between Australia and the many and varied countries of the Asian region. And can I thank Blackmores on your behalf for sponsoring tonight. It's a pretty terrific company, Blackmores. It's been very successful. It understands the opportunities in the Asian region. And I think the energy that Marcus and many others have brought to activities is evident by the way in which they embrace such causes as the Asia Society. Our links with Asia are really, I suppose, twofold. There's an understanding that we belong together to a region and that region and its members have a lot in common. But there is also an understanding that the bilateral relations between Australia and the different countries of the Asian area are not only varied, but they're also quite fundamental to the way in which we conduct our foreign policy. I think of the many things that we've been reminded of in the last few years on the foreign policy scene, particularly by such events as the decision of the United Kingdom to leave the European Union, is that we still live in a world of the nation state. And although multilateral organisations are important and they do very valuable work, relations between nations are still far more important than many commentators give them credit for. And in this context, and certainly against the backdrop of the cloud called North Korea hanging over us at the moment, there is no bilateral relationship in the world that is more important than that between the United States and the People's Republic of China. And so much will hang on that, and so much hangs on that for us in Australia. And one of the things that we must understand is that we should always negotiate, in a sense, our relations with the Asian region against the backdrop of our long-standing and priceless association with the United States of America. And as we look at North Korea, and we worry about it, and we should worry about it, because you have the ambitions of an evil man whose political balance one must have real concerns about, pursuing nuclear ambitions. And the two nations that have the capacity more than any others, and I think of those two, China even more so than the United States, to bring about a change in attitude on the part of North Korea is something that we should keep very much in mind. Tonight is an occasion for celebration, but it's also an occasion for stock-taking of what has been achieved, of the successes and the failures of Australia's engagement with the Asian region over the last 20 years. Tonight is also an occasion to give thanks to the courage of people in the past who've made a contribution to that association. And to my mind, nobody can go past the extraordinary courage that was displayed by John McEwen as the Trade Minister in the Menzies government in the 1950s, when along with the current Prime Minister of Japan's grandfather, Mr. Kishi, who was then Prime Minister of Japan, there was negotiated the Japan-Australia Commerce Agreement. That was the real trailblazer of Australia's economic engagement with the Asian region, and it wasn't easy. The negotiation of that agreement was bitterly criticised by Australian manufacturers and also by sections, not all, but sections of the RSL, because it was only 12 years after the end of World War II, and that government of Robert Menzies included such people as the father of Australia's longest-serving foreign minister, Alec Downer, the father of Alexander Downer, who'd been a prisoner of war during that conflict that had only ended 12 years before. And that was an act of very great courage, and interestingly enough, it was signed in 1957. And 1957 was also, coincidentally, the year that the Treaty of Rome was signed, which was the foundation document of the European Common Market. And of course, as Britain retreated from imperial preference and went into Europe, only of course to reverse that decision many decades later, and good on them for doing so in my view, but I know that wasn't the view of the Australian government at the time. When Britain did that, the fact that we had signed that agreement with Japan meant that we had, as it were, a glide path into a deeper association with Japan, and it became, in many ways, the iron lung of Australia's exports through the 1970s. But it wasn't easy. It was opposed, as I say, by the manufacturers and other interests, and also, incidentally, it was voted against when we tried to ratify the treaty. It was voted against in the Australian Parliament by the then Labor Party in opposition. So it wasn't easy. It wasn't a bipartisan embrace at that time. But as we look at the last 20 years, a couple of things emerge very plainly. It has been, the relationship between Australia and the Asian region has been a remarkable economic success story. It's also been a success story on the people-to-people front. 20 years ago, the most widely spoken foreign language in Australia was almost certainly Italian or Greek. Now it is Chinese. Now that simple fact records an extraordinary expansion in the people-to-people links between the region. And we see it all around us, and it's something that we should be very proud of. The level of successful integration of Asian migrant communities into the Australian broader community has been remarkably successful. And of course, as we reflect on the economic events of the last 10 years, we have to acknowledge the extraordinary contribution that our export trade with North Asia, particularly but not only with China, made to Australia being able to sail through, relatively speaking, the impact of the global financial crisis. You might also forgive me for just gently mentioning that there was another thing that helped us sail through, and that was the superb fiscal condition and in which a former government left Australia in 2008. But no more commercials from me on that. But the economic story is something that goes deeper than that. It's also been part of the transformation through globalisation of so much of the world. In the last 20 years, hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty, many of them out of absolute poverty. And this is the success story of greater trade in the region, the success story of globalisation and of competitive capitalism. And we have in many ways been partners with countries of Asia in that process. And it's something that we should reflect on. Of course, we should also reflect on, as Mr. Chapman did, the contribution that Australia was economically strong enough to make in the wake of the Asian financial downturn in 97-98 to the economies of Indonesia and Thailand and others. And we were able to do that because we were seen as friends and partners in Asia. We were able to do it because we were economically powerful enough to do it. And one of the things that has happened in the last 20 years between Australia and Asia is that we have been an active partner and participant in so many of the momentous events of the region. I, of course, remember very vividly the leadership role that Australia played in relation to East Timor. That was a very difficult issue because it brought us into conflict with our nearest neighbour, Indonesia. And we're long enough in the friendship and old enough of friends to acknowledge that sometimes that relationship is not easy. We are vastly different countries, and there's no point in pretending otherwise. In fact, we make it easier when we recognise the reality. But we were able to do that because we were seen at that particular time as leading an intervention force that was not a white Western intervention force. Although Australia and New Zealand contributed mightily to it, it was a regional intervention force, and it was seen as something that was acting on behalf of the whole region to stabilise the situation in East Timor. And although that encountered difficulties in our relationship with Indonesia, that relationship recovered. And one of the things that I have made a point of doing is, when I address gatherings in the region in my role as an ex-Prime Minister, is to remind people of the extraordinary journey in democracy that Indonesia has travelled since 1998. I dealt with 5 Indonesian presidents, and the last Indonesian president, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, was the first directly elected Indonesian president in the history of that country. And one of the more moving occasions I had as Prime Minister of this country that symbolised the new relationship between Australia and the nations of Asia was to attend his inauguration as president not long after the 2004 election, and to have the privilege in a very informal gathering after his inauguration of speaking on behalf of regional leaders in congratulating the president. Indonesia is now undeniably the 3rd largest functioning democracy in the world. And that's a great achievement. It's something we ought to be proud of, not in any kind of condescending or patronising sense, but to recognise the achievement that a country with the diversity of Indonesia and the challenges of Indonesia has been able to achieve that and to achieve that transition. And of course, when we're thinking of functioning democracies, we ought to remind ourselves of the continuing story of that great nation of India, which of course has hung on to the parliamentary Westminster system and democratic government ever since, apart from a very brief period under Mrs. Gandhi when there was martial law, has hung on ever since independence in 1947. And the strength of India's institutions was demonstrated, to my mind, again last week, when the Indian Supreme Court ruled that certain forms of divorce recognised under Islamic law but not embraced by many Islamic countries, which grossly discriminated against women, was contrary to the constitution of the Federal Republic of Indonesia. And in that particular decision, probably struck a greater blow for women's rights in Asia than any decision or development that I have seen in recent years. I think it's important when we examine relations between Australia and the nations of Asia that we don't only look at those relations in the context of regional activities, although they are enormously important. But of course, when we look at the situation in Asia, not everything has, of course, gone in the right direction. And although tonight is not an occasion to engage in a micro-analysis, democracy in some parts of Asia has gone backwards over the past few years, and we must be concerned about that. But having reflected a little bit on the past, and having talked about the present, what we really need to do tonight, if we are to rededicate ourselves to the cause of Australia being in every way an accepted and comfortable friend and partner in the Asian region, but recognising that the goal of our foreign policy should always be Asia first, but not Asia only, because Australia is, in every sense of the word, a citizen of the entire world. We should think about the future. And the greatest challenge we have at the present time in the economic area is that we are living in a very different economic paradigm. There's nobody in this room, I promise you, has lived in a world of lower interest rates than we are living at the present. And if anybody can prove me wrong, please put their hand up. I don't think you can. And we are living in a world not only of very low interest rates, but we're living in a world of flatlining real wages. We are living in a world where a vast amount of money printing by central banks has not had the desired economic consequences. We are living in a very challenging economic paradigm. And when you live in challenging economic paradigms, people and countries potentially retreat to their worst instincts, and they start contemplating putting up barriers to trade and all that's associated with trade and commerce. And when I look at the extraordinary economic achievements of the Asian region, of which Australia has been a part, and the liberation of so many people from poverty, which has been a feature of the last 20 years, I would hope that one of the things we might try to do, not only through the Asian Society, but as people who see the future of this country as very much a continuation of what's been achieved over the last 20 years, that we recommit ourselves to the cause of openness in trade, recommit ourselves to the cause of welcoming foreign investment, providing it obeys the rules that are laid down by our country. This nation has always been a beneficiary of foreign investment. British investment in the first place and continuing, then American investment, then Japanese, and more recently an increase in Chinese investment. And a cardinal rule of Australian economic policy must always, and foreign policy for that matter, must always be that we welcome people who want to invest in the future of Australia according to the laws of Australia, and that we must never give any impression to the contrary that we discriminate in any way when it comes to investment. But very importantly, we have to recommit ourselves to the cause of open trade, of globalisation, and all the things that have brought about the manifest improvements and the manifest achievements of the past 20 years. The world is living in some respects, a rather weird economic and political time. We find things harder to predict than we did a few years ago. Now, the challenge is not to fall back on our worst instincts of protection. The challenge really is to recommit ourselves to what has brought us to where we are now. I'm not suggesting that the Asian region is some kind of model of complete economic and legal openness. It plainly isn't. And there's a lack of transparency in many countries in the region. But fundamentally, the last 20 to 30 years has been a story of the great success of openness in economic matters, of openness in trade, of welcoming competitive capitalism, of welcoming investment. And if I could leave you with one message above everything else tonight, is that if we believe in the future of the region, that if we believe that the partnership between Australia and the region and Australia and the individual countries of the region has been so remarkable and so successful, then in this time when some of these economic successes have been put under challenge, we should recommit ourselves to the cause of economic openness and particularly openness in trade between the nations, not only of our region, but the nations of our region and the rest of the world. I conclude by, again, congratulating all of those who've committed themselves to the cause of improving links with our neighbours in the region. I thank individual Australians who've in their commercial endeavours and in their personal endeavours, have deepened and broadened those links, because it has plainly been to the great benefit of our country and the great benefit of our friends and neighbours in the Asian region. Thank you.